Good evening, everyone. I hope you've all been able to take in some of today's talks, performances, lectures, and the installations by Felicity Hammond and Hannah Yu in our foyer. But if not, we encourage you to spend some time with our resident sheep and Tesla. For tonight's last discourse event, but certainly not the weekends, we have How to Make a Refugee, a talk by Tom Keenan, who is a professor of comparative literature at Bard College, where he teaches human rights, media, and critical theory. His lecture takes its starting point, the short film by artist Phil Collins of the same name. It's a short document of an encounter in a Moldovan refugee camp between refugees from Kosovo and international media in 1999. Tom's talk explores the confusing relation between agency and representation that happens when people find themselves needing to make claims for and offer evidence of their very humanity. After his lecture, Tom will be joined by Anna Engelhardt, who is very familiar to the Transmediale crowd. Anna is an alias of a video artist and writer whose investigative practice follows traces of material violence, focusing on what could be seen as the ghost of information. They were also to be joined tonight by Leo Galibert-Lanet, a French researcher, filmmaker, and tenured assistant professor in film studies at the American University of Paris, but who can now unfortunately not travel or participate in the conversation due to health reasons. So we will miss Leo tonight, and we send you our best. However, tonight, Anna and Tom will not be alone. At a point in the conversation, they'll open up the floor and welcome questions from the audience, so you'll all have a chance to be in conversation together. So for now, please join me in welcoming Tom Keenan to the Transmediale stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Elise. And thank you as well to the rest of the Transmediale team, to Ben and to Marina and Neza and all the tech people and the backstage people. It's really exciting to be here. I'm sorry that Leo is not going to be here, but I'm extremely excited to talk with Anna. I start with a little epigraph from Hannah Arendt. It's entirely possible that the loss of home and political status can become identical with being expelled from humanity altogether. A couple of summers ago in Rome, I watched with some awe as a vast plume of smoke rose in the near distance, the black trace of a seemingly huge fire that burned for hours and hours and covered the city in a haze. Later that day, I heard that it had been burning in what people called the Roma camp. Not Roma like the city of Rome, but rather an encampment of Roma people. As it turned out, that was incorrect, but the rumor was symptomatically interesting. Search the media for news of fires in Rome in the summer of 2022, and you'll quickly learn that just 2 weeks later, the Roma camp had been on fire, and not for the first time. 35 inhabitants were treated for smoke inhalation, and 2 were hospitalized. It was the latest in a series of fires in and around the camp, and it was easy to imagine that it would not be the last. Roma camp was an easy explanation for every smoke cloud over the city. The other day, teaching Eytan Gündüz'ün excellent book, Rightlessness in an Age of Rights, I realized that my accidental encounter with this trope was a secret pathway into a longer and much darker story. Roma camp was not just a nickname for recurrent disasters. It was the name of a human rights crime scene, one in which the perpetrators of the crime allowed us to understand something basic about how rightlessness is produced and how it can be answered. Gündüz writes, and this is a lengthy quotation, On November 1st, 2000, it's a lengthy quotation, but it's extremely contemporary too. On November 1st, 2007, Italy put into effect an emergency decree that allowed citizens of other EU states to be summarily expelled on the order of local prefects if they were judged to be a threat to public safety. The decree resulted from the public outrage following the rape and murder of an Italian woman, allegedly by a Roma immigrant. Drafted by the Italian government in an emergency session on October 31st, it came into force overnight, and the next day bulldozers started to level the shanty towns where Roma immigrants lived. Carlos Mosca, the prefect of Rome at the time, defended the decree by referring to the bestial nature of the crime, bestial as in beast, as in animal. He said, "A hard line is needed because faced with animals, the only way to react is with maximum severity," unquote. Still quoting from Gundugdu, "The deportation order and the leveling of homes endeavored to remove the Roma immigrants from the political and social fabric of Italy. In addition, the statement of the prefect shows that such extreme measures cannot be taken without some kind of desubjectivization, to use Judith Butler's term, as the immigrants in question were rendered non-subjects, constituted," she's quoting Butler here, "as the less than human without entitlement to rights, as the humanly unrecognizable." End of quotation. The smoke that hung over the city that and other days was the sign then, not just of the fire and the destruction it caused, but of repeated destruction, destruction upon destruction, an ongoing erasure and the renewed loss of home and status. The Roma camp just catches on fire, and the inhabitants disappear, are disappeared in that cloud of smoke. At its core, the struggle for human rights begins in this situation, in the placeless place occupied by members of the category that Arendt called the rightless. And it was her singular insight to begin the analysis of human rights, not with those who have them, but with those who don't. She says, "Once they had left their homeland, they remained homeless. Once they'd left their state, they became stateless. Once they had been deprived of their human rights, they were rightless, the scum of the earth." That's from Origin of Totalitarianism. This trail of displacements leads her to the paradoxical situation in which, quote, "the man who is nothing but a man," unquote, is just one judgment or hard line shy of expulsion from humanity altogether, of becoming humanly unrecognizable. And there are others who were never even included in the first place, somehow preemptively or always already excluded. Those born into enslavement, for example. In both cases, the demand for rights is spoken then from the place of not having them, which is also to say of not counting or being counted as a rights holder, as a human being, of non-recognition. So the question is how to make oneself count, how to emerge from invisibility or inaudibility, how to make a claim to membership or participation in one world from a position in what is effectively another world altogether, how to reorganize the world so that it includes you. In her analysis of the rights-claiming strategies of undocumented migrants, or the sans-papiers in France, Gundugdu calls on an unusual word she learns from Arendt to describe this process. She writes, "In the absence of prior authorization, sans-papiers, people, undocumented people, people without papers, have engaged in inventive practices to render their speech audible and intelligible, to position themselves as political subjects capable of making rights claims, and to establish the validity of those claims by wooing the consent of their interlocutors." And I'm very interested in this little word, woo. Later, she quotes the source of this notion, which is in Arendt's lectures on Kant's political philosophy. Unlike the objective validity of a scientific truth that can compel us without any persuasion, a new rights claim can achieve its intersubjective validity by striving to woo or court the agreement of everyone else. And again, a few pages later, she writes that, quote, "The actions of sans-papiers underscore that new rights claims cannot have the irrefutable validity of mathematical truths. These claims are in need of representative practices that strive to woo or court the assent of others." I realized in teaching these passages that this is a paper about wooing, about the indignity, but also the art, the performance of wooing. Does recognition, which I'm understanding here as the radical emergence from structural invisibility, somehow depend on wooing? I realized, wooing and courting involve, as Gundogdu says, representative or representational practices. Sometimes they can be demonstrative, demanding. One version of this could be seen on the bridge in Shanghai, where a protester named Peng Lifa, quoting a news report, hung 2 protest banners on a highway crossover in central Beijing in mid-October. Sorry, not Shanghai, Beijing. A visual and verbal claim that read in part, quote, "We don't want lies, we want dignity. We don't want leaders, we want elections. We don't want to be slaves, we want to be citizens." Another version could be read in a news account from the 2015 so-called Great Summer of Migration about a Syrian family of Bashar al-Nusrat, who tells a reporter in broken English, "We don't want to go to a camp. We pay our money to move on. We escaped from our country because our army was killing us and breaking us. So better we stay in Syria, in our house, not to sleep in the floor." He said he's been invited to Germany, and he was speaking in Budapest. He said he's been invited to Germany and is desperate to get there. "We are not animals, we are human. If they are human too, we need something. We need to know what will happen to us," unquote. Mr. al-Nusrat was interviewed at the Budapest train station, where another demonstrator carried a banner reading, "Wir sind auch Menschen," we are humans too, or we're people too. We're not animals, we're human, and we insist that this difference be recognized by those who already call themselves human. The statement needs to be made because recognition is required and it can only come from others. We, they say, speaking to those others, we want to be treated differently by you, seen and heard in a new way, or seen and heard for the first time as something new. You treat us as, or as if we were, animals. Al-Nusrat's compressed protest cites sleeping on the floor and not having a sense of what will happen next in his life. And we want to move from that category to another. We need to claim this because our humanity has vanished, because we're not treated as humans. The claim is necessary, but it functions only by asserting that what is missing, our humanity, is in fact already ours. We are already human, just like the others whom we address, but they do not see us, or do not see us that way. The fact that it can vanish or never have appeared in the first place is what makes the claiming, whether it's verbal, sonic, visual, whatever, and the demonstrating, hanging banners, holding signs, essential. Humanity, then, is not a baseline or a ground. It is a statement, a demand, a request, and an accomplishment when it's accepted, but it's a contingent one. These most obvious statements still need to be stated, and they need to be demonstrated, put into action, performed, and materialized. Hence the protests, the enactment, or the reappropriation of the capacity to flee and to move, the claim to space and to voice. The word claim comes from the Latin word clamo, clamare, to shout, to cry out, to clamor. Perhaps these are assertive modes of wooing. They are claims to what ought to go without saying, but in fact need to be said and seen, and they seek to put what is presently taken for granted, the line between human and non-human, which is also to say what is presently denied, putting that into contention, into negotiation, up for grabs. Claiming that we are not slaves or that we are also humans is a manner of challenging the existing definition of membership, disputing the rules of inclusion, but it is not addressed to some external authority, some independent author of the rules of the game. The addressees of this claim are the players of the game who constitute the rules in playing it. And the claim seeks to change the rules of the game and the makeup of the players. They, the other players, need to be persuaded. We can read this in the little word "to." We are also humans, or we are humans too. In the comparison between us and them, or the extension from them to us, is a claim to equality. Although where one sleeps, on the floor or in a house, and what one can imagine about one's future might seem to be the most private of matters, Mr. Al-Nusrat makes them public and political. He disputes the fact that he is presently denied that to which others have access. Claiming one's humanity is not simply to reassert ownership over something that one has lost. It is to dispute its existing definition, to put it in play, to challenge its monopolization by others, by addressing those others. There's no magical formula for this address. Wooing, or this kind of claiming, is situational rhetoric. It can be indignant, or it can be undignified, or it can even be indecent. I borrow this word from Lindsay Stonebridge in a reading of what she calls refugee style in Arendt. She brings this unexpected word to our attention and takes us back to the exposure, the constitutive self-exposure of the claim or demand. To seek to appear out of disappearance, to challenge one's vanishing, is a rupture, a break, an affront. She writes, quoting Arendt in The Human Condition, "There seems to be no bridge from the most radical subjectivity in which I am no longer recognizable to the outer world of life." End of quote from Arendt. Continuing Stonebridge, she is writing about the experience of pain, but that most radical subjectivity surely also recalls something of the plight of the refugee. Like the suffering body, the body of the refugee is not recognized by the outer world. To speak from within the subjectivity of the refugee, then, is to bring the concealed into public light, which might be why Arendt chooses to describe such a telling as indecent. The indecency of refugee style, we might say, is the writing of the vanguard, a writing back into the public and political realm from the position of the stateless. End of quote. How does one become recognizable? It may seem as if there is a vast gulf that separates the fierce bravery of the truth teller from the desperate quest for recognition. But Stonebridge shows us that indecency captures the radicality of both outspokenness and of unveiling and even undressing, and I'll show you that later. The insistent demand that tries to conjure into existence a bridge from invisibility and inaudibility to recognition, or even membership in a community, which is to say that claims the right to politics, to wrest it away from those who have seized it as their exclusive privilege. One way of phrasing that claim is to say, we are also human beings. There is a difference, Arendt shows us, between taking this for granted, on the one hand, and on the other hand, having the courage to see that even human status must be asserted, demanded, and fought for, and that this is a political struggle, a struggle for politics itself. In May of 1999, the British artist Phil Collins, not the rock star, shot a short film in the refugee camps on the Macedonian-Kosovo border that were then home to many of the hundreds of thousands of Kosovars expelled by Serbian troops and police before and during the NATO air campaign. Collins called it How to Make a Refugee, and unlike in there, it's uncapitalized. It's just How to Make a Refugee. And in it, he demonstrates that, in addition to the legal and political apparatus that constitutes some people as refugees, there is a photographic or a mediatic one as well. Refugees are made by, among other things, cameras. Collins took his camera into the camps at Chegrane and Stankovac and followed a group of journalists who were speaking with refugees, taking testimonies, gathering evidence. How to Make a Refugee is an unusual 12-minute portrayal of one such encounter between these investigators and their subjects. Packed into a small room with the journalists and two families from Kosovo, Collins's camera documents the visual and narrative practices by which the figure of the refugee is constructed. A journalist interviews, through a translator, a 15-year-old boy who tells the story of his family's flight from Kosovo and the violent interruptions of that journey by the Serbian police and the Macedonian border guards, while at the same time the photographer takes his picture. And at the same time, Collins's camera watches the pictures being taken. The boy has been injured, and when asked, he takes off his shirt to reveal the stitches closing what seemed to be a wound in his stomach, and lifts up his leg to show that it's been broken and is in a cast. He exhibits his body for the cameras as much as for the visitors. Flashbulbs are popping, people are moving around, a light meter is positioned in front of his face, his baseball cap is taken off and put back on, and Collins's camera, participating in the production without fully being part of it, shows us not only his story and his injuries, but also their presentation and their documentation. It's a document of a document, an image of the making of an image. In the second part of the film, the action shifts from the boy's testimony to the larger group of refugees, these two families. And Collins shows us the somewhat awkward wrangling by the photographer of the boy's family and the other family with whom they are living onto a not large enough couch for a group portrait. Once positioned, everyone smiles as their picture is taken, the crew packs up and leaves, and the film ends. I'm going to show you the first about 3.5 minutes of the film, and it will start exactly as the film starts. It has no title, it has no credits, it doesn't name its filmmaker, it doesn't say where it is, it doesn't say anything. And in particular, you'll note, it doesn't have any subtitles, even though a considerable part of the film is spoken in Albanian. Oops, that's the sound, don't want to move that. And I should warn you, the boy does take off his shirt. He does show injuries. It's not particularly graphic. It's just kind of indecent.
Maybe all of?
Yeah.
Gekke kryddmajzer? Twee gekke Gekke kryddmajzer. Kijk, dat is maar meer.
It's better all out, all off.
Şeker de mayısından direkt var. Hayır, mamile de şöyle görünüyor. Nereden şeyden?
No, it's better we don't, no?
No, it's good with the hat on. It shows that.
It's good without hand.
Well, looking here. Looking.
Şöyle.
We just quickly check the lighting now. Be messing this one. It's pressed, yeah. Pointing not up at the ceiling, not up at the ceiling, straight at me. That's it. More flash. Then the thing here. One moment. Change. Little.
What's his name, Tati?
Şekerinin
Bashir Ali. Bashir Ali.
Beşir. B. E. Beşir. S. H. E. R.
And will you ask how old he is?
Sovyet'teki
This one, yeah.
15.
And it happened at the border, the black.
Как je gadu kabloza po?
Yo, from Madina.
Ka? Malina. Malina.
Okay.
Okay, we'll stop it there on the flowers. This film is generally interpreted as a critical expose of the tropes and strategies by which the news media constructs humanitarian or disaster narratives. It exposes the mechanisms of the exposure of suffering. The mise en scène, the framing of the story, is brought into the frame and becomes the story itself. And later, as the film goes on, so this is like 3 minutes-ish, 2:50. In the next 9 minutes, more conversation happens, and slowly the camera moves away from Bashir to show you that there's a bunch of other people there watching and constructing the scene, cameras, journalists, etc. The mise en scène is brought into the frame and becomes the story itself. The soft violence of the making of the refugee by the camera is laid bare, literally. The refugees do not so much present themselves as submit themselves to being represented by others. One reviewer summarizes this line of interpretation as follows, quote, "Each element comes together within the frame, and the boy, at first identifiably human, vanishes into the image. The cliché, Muslim, rural, peasant, poor, is accomplished. The subject is ready for consumption," unquote. This interpretation repeats the general theorem according to which refugees are or are made to be speechless emissaries, in the much-quoted phrase of Lisa Malki. An image of the vanishing of the individual into the image. Surely this does happen. Humans do go missing, do disappear, and not just their bodies, but their very status as humans. And images can enable or even effect that disappearance, whether by stereotyping, by fixing, by classifying, or by cataloging. A boy with a name and a life and an individual story is transferred into a status, an example, a type. This status is not a matter of fact, but something that needs to be accomplished, and here we see it happening. And so this reading goes in a rather involuntary or even compulsory manner. The photographs taken then are a close cousin of the identification photos or the mug shot that we know well. Not only the state constitutes subjects photographically, though. Where refugees are concerned, we can see the quasi-governmental power of the institutions of the so-called international community, the UNHCR or the ICRC, human rights organizations, and of the image-based media, at work precisely where the state, in the strict sense, is absent. It is not citizens who are being registered and constructed here, but refugees. Yet these images function in a very similar fashion to those on an identification card or a passport or any other institutional registry. They confer a status, sometimes a legal one, sometimes a political one, sometimes simply a public or popular one. And that status can displace, swallow up, disfigure, and remake any prior identity. As Ariela Azule summarizes the process, a photograph of a refugee deprives the person who was forced to be a refugee of the chance to appear as a person who refuses to be evacuated from his homeland and become a refugee. The spectator is invited to acknowledge that person as forever refugee, since the spectator is assumed to come after the event was decided, unquote. She's not talking about this particular image, but of this as an example. This is an example of what she's talking about. This reading is not incorrect, but I don't think it's entirely adequate either. As Tina Camp shows us in her readings of ID photos and mugshots and prison registries in Listening to Images, quote, the unexceptional format of ID photos and the routinized nature of bureaucratic images frequently lead to a failure to read or a blanket dismissal of them altogether, as we are tempted to see only their success in capturing mute, governmentalized subjects of the state, unquote. She instead encourages us to listen, to feel the force communicated in these images, in what she calls their paradoxical capacity to rupture the sovereign gaze of the regimes that created them by refusing the very terms of photographic subjection they were engineered to produce, unquote. So, coincident with this production of the stereotyped and speechless refugee subject, there is also something else, something discordant going on here. I think we can see a claim being made and the making visible of the apparatus that constructs and transmits that claim. The refugee, this guy, 15-year-old Besher Haliti, speaks and tells a story, presents himself, not under conditions of his own choosing, and there are never conditions entirely of one's own choosing, but under the conditions that are necessary, if not sufficient, for his speech to be heard and the marks on his body to be seen. Now, I'm going to play through some of what actually happens in the remainder of the video, but I just want to note that it required me to harness the services of a student of mine from Kosovo to transcribe and then translate what's happening in this film. And I think it's notable that that extra layer of work or of beginning to supply some content or some context is necessary for understanding this, and I'm interested in what you think about that. The photo shoot begins with the journalist asking Besher to take off his shirt to show the photographer where he was wounded. And one of the family members encouragingly comments about the journalists, "I feel like I've seen them somewhere." The implication is that they are worth courting. Besher's baseball cap is arranged on his head for the sake of the image. One of the journalists says, "It's good with the hat on." Finally, he takes over, Besher takes over. So he's been kind of organized and arranged and pictured, and then he starts talking. They don't ask him anything. They ask him what his name is and how to spell it, that's all. "I will tell you what happened. I will tell you how it happened," he says in Albanian. "We were coming back, and then we were caught by the Macedonian army. And then a relative out of the frame interrupts to add, 'First we were caught by the Serbs.' Besher protests, 'Yes, but I'm just telling them about when we fell on the landmines. I'm not sure who stepped on it, but it threw us up in the air and we were wounded. At that point, a female member of the family tells the translator, "Sister, you should see his leg." And Becher exhibits his broken leg for the camera. After that, the event is swallowed by the logistics of the group photo, which involves an enumeration of the kinship relations among all the sitters and the lengthy process of gathering them into the frame of a single photo in a very small room. They are comfortable with, even inviting of, the camera and clearly familiar with the ritual of posing. "Everyone look into the camera," says the translator, and the shoot is over. If the film shows us the operation of registration in the impositional sense, it also shows us a performance, the appropriation or the reappropriation of the machinery of capture for another purpose. The terms of the encounter between Becher and his family and those cameras and questioners are not fully set by the forces of those institutions. Participating in the ritual, Becher can make something else out of it, appear rather than disappear. He could not do this on his own. He is not a fully autonomous actor. In fact, he is the farthest thing from that. Displaced, injured, the survivor of extreme violence, he starts from a position of near invisibility or muteness. And that is, in fact, the way the part that I showed you goes. But the situation imposed on him is also an opportunity afforded to him, and he takes advantage of it. Although the scene in which he finds himself situated is not designed for him, nor to serve his purposes, he makes something of it nevertheless. He acts as if he is a subject, not simply of mercy or pity, but a subject with rights, a subject who can make a claim, who can tell his story and present its evidence. On this reading, two incompatible and yet related subjects emerge in this encounter, in something like a parallax effect. The one could not appear without the other. Becher Halidi appears in a forum with strongly determined rules and conventions and procedures, with terms and conditions, as they say, that cannot simply be ignored or broken because they are constitutive of the space. Without playing by them, he cannot and does not appear. And they can have the effect of furthering his disappearance. But we see that he has the capacity to do something else with them, too. Not simply to obey them, but to enlist them in another project, another performance. The terms on which he is given the opportunity to appear can, it seems, be changed in the taking. Becher knows, we could say, that evidence does not speak for itself. It needs transmitters, ventriloquists, translators, staging, light meters. So he turns what was supposed to be a unilateral encounter into a bilateral one. What we can imagine began as his more or less involuntary response to a summons becomes, in the event itself, reversed or refigured into something like a collaboration. Asymmetrical to be sure, but nonetheless something done together, in which the questioners and the photographers themselves are turned into the more or less involuntary facilitators of this second subject's emergence. How to Make a Refugee, then, shows us both dimensions of Arendt's indecency, or even a form of refugee style, the constitution of the refugee subject and its de- and reconstitution, thanks to the camera. Collins shows us another dimension of this process a few years later in a very different film called Why I Don't Speak Serbian in Serbian, in which he returns to other parts of the footage he had shot in those camps. In the midst of a longer film composed of studio interviews shot in black and white, we find about 5 minutes of color film of the camp's inhabitants going about their daily lives, their daily camp lives, interrupted by, attracted by his camera. Like the sit-down interviews, they are also portraits, children and families playing, promenading, selling, building, eating, but most of all, posing. Now I'll show you a little bit of this. Sorry. In an interview later, Collins recalled his time in those camps, and he surprises his interviewer with this claim. It sounds ridiculous now, and it's difficult for me not to romanticize the situation or my role within it, but I distinctly remember that not to take a picture would have been an insult. And the interviewer says not to take it, and he says, every few minutes or every few steps I made, someone would say, take my picture. They wanted some marker, as if this chaos needed to be recorded. Even when I had no film left, simply to take the picture without film was a necessary transaction, which justified my presence there. Posing or pausing tells us everything here. We can hear in this excited demand, take my picture, not just an instruction or an imperative, but a claim to visibility and audibility, a claim to appear and be recognized, a claim to count, to be counted and to matter. A primal sort of right is being articulated and enacted here, a right to claim rights in front of and thanks to the camera, in the very gesture of acting as if you have the right to have your picture taken. The camera opens a space for performance, even when there's no film left. Standing still for the camera is a way of making the camera stand still for you, of focusing its gaze, of taking over the space it makes available. What better figure for this encounter in which registration reaches a 0 degree and recognition takes over than the picture without film? This is the beginning of an answer to the conundrum Collins discovered in the unexpected joy of the little girl in the camp and the self-exposure of Beshar Halidi. Yes, people in refugee camps stand still for other people with cameras because people who need to make claims need people to whom to make them and helpers to transmit those messages. I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a fantastic lecture. It was a pleasure. I want to ask everyone, if possible, to not pass by the central entrance and use the side ones. Otherwise, you're going to be obstructing the image. So I would be very grateful if that would not be happening. Yeah, just to give you a heads up, I'm going to do 5-10-minute response to Tom's lecture, and then we're going to jump to Q&A. So yeah, in my response, I want to explore how does a crime lab make a terrorist? This is the central question of our film Terror Element. September 99 saw a series of apartment bombings that sent shockwaves across Russia. These bombings, pivotal to the country's expansionist ambitions, provided the justification for the second invasion of Chechnya and catalyzed Vladimir Putin's rise to power. Intelligence agencies, the police, and the media quickly blamed the Chechen independence movement, despite their denial of any involvement. a quote-unquote Chechen trace was detected by news anchors, camera operators, and police officers in the explosions. In this response, I will explore how the image of a terrorist was constructed through the story of Timur Dakhilgov. Born in Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, Dakhilgov was arrested shortly after the bombings, branded a terrorist, and after enduring half a year of detention and torture, was eventually acquitted and released with no explanation whatsoever.
Два дома сразу вешают. И тот дом, и этот дом, и на Бурянова, и на Шел по 200, по двум статьям, 222 хранение
Нам же гранату подкинули же здесь.
хранение оружия.
Что якобы у нас граната в комнате была.
И потом на меру пресечения, когда на суд вывозили, эту статью отменили и повесили на 205-ю часть 3. Ну, в принципе, я не понял, что это за статья, конечно. В камере, когда я уголовный кодекс взял и прочитал, что это за статья и что она светит, я, конечно, сон потерял надолго.
Что это, кстати? Какой терроризм?
205-я часть 3. Жертвы с многочисленными жертвами.
Совершение террористического акта.
От 12 до 20 и на пожизненное заключение.
Сегодня в ФСБ подтвердили факт задержания 2 подозреваемых в причастности к взрыву. Пока они задержаны в соответствии с законом на 3 суток. По данным ТАРТАСС, эти подозреваемые жители Чечни, работающие в коммерческих фирмах, которые располагались на 1-м этаже взорванного дома. Но никаких других подробностей в спецслужбах сейчас не сообщают.
Так ее покручивайте, чтобы я не очень быстро, чтобы я ее видел. Ага. В обратную сторону.
Батарейка, чтобы видно было, да?
Угу.
Ну, это старенькое, ему, наверное, лет 20. Батареек таких уже, не знаю, если выпускаются.
Ага. Да. Вот эти крючочки.
А можно ее, они опускаются, тумблеры? Ну,
да.
Это же важно, потому что так...
Потом вытащили из кадра и туда подмагните ее.
Props are crucial in storytelling. They construct a character. They give the audience subconscious clues about the character's situation, adding authenticity and drawing the viewer into the scene. In our film, Terror Element, we explore how props become a storytelling device for the state. When trying to frame someone as a terrorist, it's common to show or mention a weapon. The object thus must be rendered real for the story to hold. However, the explosive device itself is a particularly tricky prop. It self-destructs during an explosion. How do we present an object that simply cannot exist? The answer lies in context. This is where the laboratory environment comes in. The laboratory, with its sterile surfaces and scientific equipment, creates the illusion of objective truth. Here, a fabricated object is transformed into a fact. On the screen, when you see the one white unidentified powder, it's easy to forget that once placed in laboratory glassware, it immediately becomes evidence. The lab transforms what is ambiguous into something that appears irrefutable. The props we have seen so far on the screen were designed for the Moscow Crime Laboratory. They were created for a single reason, for the press to film. The footage we just saw is from several of these frequent press tours. The transition of the prop from the Moscow Crime Lab to news footage that framed Dakhilgov as a terrorist was no accident. As law professor Manika Sinha writes, police departments create crime laboratories not for testing theories and hypotheses, but for public relations, end of quote. The crime lab is a meticulously organized space bathed in harsh fluorescent light. The set is created through microscopes, glass beakers, and lab coats worn by technicians. Lab coats, in fact, are prohibited in advertisements in the US because they imply scientific authority the actors do not have. Yet, those who wear these coats in a crime lab have no scientific background either. They are graduates of Russian police academies, trained not to seek truth, but to follow orders. In another video, the operator asks a bomb handler, "What's your education? Physics? Chemistry?" He is met with silence. The CGI reconstruction of the crime laboratory is the key stage set of our film, Terror Element. Set in a modern-day crime lab, our hybrid documentary explores how images of science are weaponized to project state power. We follow Nina, a reclusive forensic expert, as she uncovers a videotape that features the notorious series of explosions across Russia from 1999. Combining digital reconstructions and archival material, the film examines the contradictory statements presented by authorities to justify the second invasion of Chechnya. Drawn into the grainy television footage, Nina tries to understand how a crime lab became a tool in this cryptic power play. As the film unfolds, her laboratory begins to resemble the televised one. Doubt seeps in. Could her own methods be part of this haunting legacy? As Nina investigates the old mystery, the crime lab itself becomes the key prop that reveals the uncomfortable truth behind her faith in science. Thank you. Shall I start with questions? Yeah, thank you for sitting through our lecture and response. Thank you, Tom, for the amazing lecture. I was thinking actually when you were talking about, since we're talking about, like fictional devices and how we construct an image, I was thinking about the concept that is called suspension of disbelief. And I don't know how much the audience knows what I'm talking about, but suspension of disbelief in fiction is the willing act of temporarily ignoring logic and critical thinking to enjoy a fictional work. And the key words here are, I think, willing and enjoying. And I think it creates an interesting connection to the word wooing, the term wooing that you are using. You all know examples of suspension of disbelief. It would be, let's say, a plot hole in a sci-fi that you enjoy, and you kind of forgive the plot hole because you really like the main character. So yeah, what does it say, like our willing suspension of disbelief, what does it say about the audience and the kind of act of wooing, like the agency of the audience in that process?
So if you're in a situation where you're not sure that anyone believes you, or even in some sense, like not in a phenomenological sense, but in some deeper sense, that they don't believe that you exist or that you deserve to exist, then you would like to induce some kind of suspension of disbelief of the sort that is produced by fiction. So I think there's and so that's what I'm imagining Besher and other people who are in the situation of having to make claims for what seems to be completely obvious. Their strategy for telling the truth or making the truth evident will have to rely on some sort of fictional maneuver, right? Fictional device. And that's what I think is so fascinating about this situation for which this is just a little example. He's pulling up his shirt, and there's a lot of other ways in which people make their humanity or their vulnerability or their status known. Sometimes it's just because they can speak a language that their interlocutor speaks, or something seemingly trivial like that, or sometimes they need to produce physical evidence of where they've been or what they've seen or what's happened to them. But they're put into a situation in which they have to act like they are an artist or a fiction crafter in order to produce the suspension of disbelief. The question of the willing is, I think, partly where the wooing element comes in. In that situation, you need to induce by sometimes sort of sneaky, underhanded, unconscious means the suspension of the pre-existing disbelief. So that was my argument about this film, and in general about the situation of that kind of claiming, when the claimant is coming from a position of radical non-recognition. Some aesthetic, fictional operation seems to be required.
But that's interesting, right? Because I think where does it put us as an audience? Because I think we as audience have a certain desire to believe that somebody's human and somebody's not. So it's kind of like, what are the structural conditions that make those people engage in those scenarios? Because I know that, for instance, with the case of terrorism in Russia, there is a certain willingness of Russians to be fooled by the propaganda, let's say. There is a certain desire to feel that kind of imperial greatness that then makes you susceptible to those narratives that are being transpired around quote-unquote Chechen threat, etc. So maybe there is a certain structural condition that makes the audience, as in white Western audience, to not be willing to believe in the humanity of those people. So I'm just very interested in the kind of like other part of the frame, like Phil Collins does a great job about like revealing what is behind the image, but I'm interested in us as kind of like viewers of this image.
Yeah. So there's, for the terrorist example, I would say there's, how to put this? The props are necessary, but somehow, in a way, they seem to me at least less necessary. They're almost, and as you show us, they're sometimes kind of laughable in their lack of seriousness. So it feels to me there that the producers of the image are comfortable in counting on the acquiescence of their audience. And the props are gestures, in a way. In the refugee situation, it's kind of flipped, right? It's sort of formally the same, but if you can count on anything, it's that your audience doesn't see you. And so your project is to utilize as many props as you can, your family, your stitches, your leg, whatever, in order to become visible as something like what you're imagining your audience is, or the way they imagine themselves. The audience, so you're asking now not about maybe the immediate audience of that press conference or media opportunity, but a secondary audience. I'm not going to speculate on Collins's intentions, but my sense is that he sees an analogy between the need to persuade the immediate audience and the need to persuade many, many secondary audiences. And maybe that's partly why he puts some of the context into the film. And we were talking earlier about how little context in kind of the historical political sense there is in this film. But there is the context of the room. And I didn't show it here, but toward the end of the film, the camera pulls back and it looks around and it shows you that you're in effectively a stage. And I take the lesson of that to be the film telling us Beshar Halidi did not just show up here. This was a project. It was a project of the media people, and it was a project of him and his family and whoever actually engineered the whole thing in the beginning. So he's diagramming for us the lengths to which it is necessary to go in order to make this claim that should go without saying. So.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because as one of my favorite contemporary philosophers, Zoe Samudzi, writes, she wrote this paper analyzing photographs of violence and specifically anti-Black violence in US, and kind of how there is a certain framing of those events always through the same kind of, it's like a pattern, right? Like we show wounds, we show dead bodies of Black people, and how it essentially helps to reinforce the structure of the racism that we have, because it constantly renders the Black body not as a threat, but as something that has been dominated into a press position and therefore not posing a threat. And it really reminds me of kind of our brief conversation before this talk about who is considered to be a human and who is not considered to be a human. I think it is very interesting about the kind of role of those images into the drawing of the boundary between like humanity essentially. And what I was reminded of is how nowadays we discuss a lot about how committing violence essentially makes the person who commits the violence less human, or like it strips that person of their humanity. And it is a very famous propaganda trope as well. When media report on the PTSD of the soldiers who commit war crimes, there's an entire genre of cinema that is called shoot and cry, where we see that mental struggle of like US soldier killing innocent people in whatever country the US is invading. Same propaganda genre is existing in Russia. But yeah, it's very interesting for me, the way that reinforces the boundary between human and non-human, and I'm sure you have a lot of...
There's two things going on in what you just said. The question of threat, non-threat. And I think that's a really a deep and complicated problem. When the very similar images can induce the sense of threat, and when I feel threatened, I will be inclined to push the source of the threat farther away from me and farther away from whatever I think I am. But also, non-threat can mean non-negligible, non-legible, doesn't register, doesn't matter, right? So if the choice that you have of how to appear is either as a threat or as a non-threat, then you're screwed, right? Doesn't seem like there's any space in between there. And I think a lot of the complexity of some of the more interesting, or a lot of the challenge, or the challenge that is faced by a lot of contemporary evidence-producing organizations and artists, is how to find a third position besides reinforcing the sense of threat, which can generate expulsion, or reinforcing the sense of non-threat, which puts something out of the frame altogether. I think it's possible. I think that's why we need creative human rights investigators and evidence producers to find new ways of depicting and narrating oppression or violence that doesn't fall into that binary, the very dark binary there. But it does give you a sense of how sort of steep that hill is to move up. So on the humanity or inhumanity of the perpetrator, I think that's a tricky one because you would be inclined to say yes, and this is, I love shoot and cry, that yes, it's not incorrect to say that perpetrating extreme violence can cost the perpetrator some sense of their own humanity. But I think we should be careful to avoid having that kind of redeem an intuitive notion that we're all humans to begin with, and it takes some like special extreme circumstance, either of oppression or of being the victim of oppression or being the perpetrator of oppression to render that status less solid. That feels to me like you want to kind of have your cake and eat it too, and convince yourself that that category remains kind of okay, and it's and if we can just bring them back, it'll be fine. So, but I understand why one would be inclined to say that the commission of an extreme crime which deprives someone else of their humanity is an act itself that's inhumane. And I think there are some really interesting scenarios. There's some scenes. There's a beautiful film about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission called Long Night's Journey into Day, in which there's a scene where a policeman is confessing his crime to the mothers of some of the kids that he killed. And one of the mothers says, they don't all agree, some of them really can't stand this guy, but others feel that his contrition is really meaningful to them. And they say something like, one of them says something like, if my giving you your humanity back means that my son gets his humanity back, then that's a price I'm willing to pay. If me treating you as a human means that you and the state retrospectively can treat him as a human. So there, I think that's an interesting version of that trope. So.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and I think also it kind of like brings us to the question of context, because a lot of stuff we're discussing is very context specific, right? Like there's no kind of platonic ideal of violence or like platonic ideal of a refugee. And it's interesting to consider, once again, how the question of context is being treated in the Phil Collins video, and then in general, how it's key to both of the concepts or terms that we engage with, both for terrorist and for a refugee as a concept. And I wanted to kind of start maybe with pointing out that archival footage that I showed on the TV today and how context flips your perception of the image, like the fact that there is a original reel from the Moscow crime lab that has the operator's voiceover changes your perception of how the bomb is being handled. If you saw the same video without the voiceover, you would perceive it totally differently. But then also the question of context in terms of filmmaker, right? Like how you reveal the process of constructing the image. And there is another filmmaker that I'm sure many of the people in the audience would know, Laura Poitras, who is having a very similar style of documentary filmmaking, where she constantly opens up the image and kind of reveals the context in which she is making the image, showing that usually she's in the room with other press members, and she's kind of just like a part of the audience. She kind of leaves the questions that she's asking her subjects inside the picture. So there is that kind of context of the image being artificial or artificially constructed. There is also kind of context that is more explicitly political, that is usually we can see on the news, where people are framing quote unquote terrorist suspects. There was a case in Germany 2 years ago where a man was accused of terrorism and then once again acquitted and released as innocent. And in his in the coverage, he was not presented almost as a real individual, but instead of talking about him as a person, there was an entire dossier of his migration history. Omar was presented as a refugee that was seeking political asylum in Germany and then was rejected political asylum in Germany, etc., etc., etc. So there was this quite distinct connection between the terrorist and the refugee in that coverage. And it is very interesting how exactly what kind of wordings they choose to provide context and what kind of stuff is left outside of the context. And yeah, it's very interesting connection to Phil Collins' film because the choice of not making the subtitles, I think is very charged. And we can maybe productively disagree in the stance from where he's coming from in that direction. But yeah, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about the importance of context as a framing device.
I have a couple of thoughts. So the film is completely puzzling, I'll confess, in its utter absence of context, even the subtitles. So you could say it's irresponsible, or you could say it's art, or you could say it's so radical, our lack of comprehension or the clues that the film gives us, the lack of clues that the film gives us about what's going on here, that it's an invitation to find out for ourselves. That is maybe slightly too redemptive on my part, but I did find I found it so puzzling after spending so long with this film that it came to feel like it might in some way be intentional and an encouragement to try to produce, for the viewer to produce their own contextual understanding. And I say that because sometimes there's a bit of a fetishism of context and a sense that having determined what the context is, we can figure out what's going on inside it. And I think there's a really instructive lesson in this from the film by Ronen Alexandrovich called The Viewing Room, in which he, a kind of dissident Israeli filmmaker, constructs a situation in which he has various people, and he chooses one finally for the film, to watch films from the occupied territories, some made by human rights organizations, some made by settlers or by the army. And he asks his subjects, as it were, to comment on them. And he finally makes the film about one, a young woman named Maya, and she is an expert in context. She's brilliant at asking, well, what happened just before the camera starts rolling? So looking at some horrifying encounter between soldiers and civilians, which for her is so troubling that she needs to figure out what came before it or what came after it or what came around it in order to make sense of it in a way that allows her to be less troubled than just watching it is. And so you have, between the filmmaker and the subject, this kind of battle, this implicit battle over, like, what is the context that's relevant for understanding this? And for her, she kind of widens the frame, and the film is about the widening of the frame, to include some elements, but not others. But it makes him wonder, like, okay, so where does the frame stop widening, or how big does it have to be, or how tight, or whatever, and he shows her very ingeniously defanging the demanders of context, because she says, I'll play the context game with you all the way. You show me a context like the occupation, I'll show you a context like what happened before, and who is this guy anyway, and so on. So I think we need to bear in mind that context too, and the appeal to context is, sooner or later can be revealed as another text that needs to be, disputed and negotiated and so on. So I'm not saying that to let Collins off the hook, because I think the radicality of this gesture is still really shocking. But I do think that we can ask questions, legit questions, about what are we asking for when we're asking for context.
Thank you. I was wondering, I know we are running out of time, so maybe we can have one question from the audience? Yeah.
Just one.
Sorry. I can't see anything, so.
Hi, thank you. I'll try to make it quick. So my question, or sort of open comment, is primarily for Thomas, but also open to you too, Anna. So I found the film very interesting because I also come from Serbia, and I was born during the war, and I grew up during this period. And what I found very interesting is that here, on the one hand, we are sort of discussing how the image of the refugee is being created, and looking at footage of young children and this kind of desire also to be perceived as a refugee. While at the same time, back home, how I grew up is this constant narrative of the demonization of Kosovar and Albanian people. And it's interesting that our government actually uses the same propaganda narrative, which is like, yeah, look at the Kosovar people, they're pretending to be refugees, and this is why we are the real victims and not them. So I just thought that was such an interesting tension there, the fact that, we are still living in a regime which is basically the legacy of Milosevic, who committed genocide. So yeah, I was just wondering if you still engage with the ongoing media narratives in the Balkans, because I think that these narratives continue to destabilize the region very much. And it's actually quite dangerous beyond just the theoretical sort of critical discussion of this image. Yeah, what do you think about this? And do you still engage with these narratives?
For me, not in a day-to-day way, as I used to, but I do think, that there's something embedded, hopefully not permanent, but something that certainly repeats, and that tension between clearly the conflict, or whatever we want to call it, between Serbia and Kosovo, particularly on that front line in the north of Kosovo, is as alive today as it was in 1999 or earlier in the 90s. So I think it would be great if you want to make a film that you should show us that the whatever it is, continued life of those cliches. I'm wondering, for the critical part of it, whether if you showed something like this today, as I just did, if, for instance, we did this in Belgrade, would this if I could, and your head is telling me that I couldn't probably, but if we could, would this reinforce which interpretation of the film would win? The one that says poor Muslim village, etc., peasant, or the one that says refugee with a claim to make against his oppressor and so on? And it feels to me that it's maybe still a little wobbly there.
Thank you so much. Sorry we didn't have a lot of time for questions, but we're happy to talk in the bar. So hopefully that's a great compromise. Thank you, everyone.